This last story is full of strange and haunting images. I am bringing it to you now that you may help me carry them out into the world. This story is called Mother, Come Back. It was collected in the 20s in what was then called Rhodesia from the Wine Makuni people who now live in modern-day Zambia. The man who collected the stories in the Bantu language and then translated them was J. Torrent, who was a member of the Society of Jesuits. So here was this man in a long black dress with his phonograph machine, sitting with village members, collecting their stories, and then printing them in a book for us to find decades later and still wonder about. This is what one woman did. She lived apart from all the others. She chose to live in the bush. She was not alone, for she had a daughter. What would make a woman take her child to live in the bush? Was it an abusive parent? An abusive spouse? An abusive king? Her child was called Mwinsa, and also she who nurses the sun. Can you imagine what a bright and shining face that child must have to be called she who nurses the sun? And they made their home in the crook of a tree that they might be safe from the world below. And as the girl grew, her mother taught her how to weave and to stitch baskets. And Mwinsa had hands that were full of artistry. As beautiful as her face was, her baskets were equally beautiful. And when she came to be a woman, she sat in the tree, weaving and stitching, and her mother would go to dig for food and to hunt. Her mother was a fine hunter. Before she left her child in the tree, she always prepared porridge, and she hung some meat for when Mwinsa was hungry. And then she would go into the bush to find them more provisions. There came a day that a man walking through the bush happened to look up, and in the tree he saw this girl with a shining face. It seemed as though the sun itself was sitting in the tree, and he thought, that is a beautiful girl. If the king would have her among his wives, all the other queens would leave the house. And he hurried back to the village to tell the king, great one, there is a woman of enormous beauty sitting in a tree in the bush. She belongs in your house, and should you bring her there, all the other queens would leave. What kind of man would want to bring that kind of drama into his own house? But hearing about her, the king decided that he must have her. And so he called some of the men of his realm. He told them to sharpen their axes, and then he sent them with the first man to find that tree. And the day they came, the mother was already in the bush hunting. Mwinsa had enjoyed her porridge and was now sitting in the tree, stitching and weaving the baskets, when the men gathered round the tree and took their axes and began to hack at the trunk of the tree, when she heard and felt the first cut of that axe into the tree, Winsa looked down and she cried out, "Mother, come back! Mother, there are men who are hacking our shade tree. Mother, come back! If the tree falls, I fall." And her mother dropped down among them as if from the sky, and she held up her spear and she said to the men, "Many as you are, I will stitch you with my sharp, sharp needle. Stitch, stitch." And all but one fell dead upon the ground. It was not the sharpness of her spear that killed them, but the sharpness of her words and incantations. She left the one man alive to go back to the village and advise the king against coming again. And when he came before the great one, he said, "Things went rather badly for us. I am the only one left." And the king now knew that this was not only a girl of great beauty, but perhaps of great power, and so he wanted her. He said, "Rest, and we will gather some more men and try again tomorrow. Sharpen your axes." And in the morning, another group of men went into the forest with the one survivor, and they found the tree, and in the tree was Winsa, working on the baskets. And when she heard the axes strike the trunk of the tree, she called out, "Mother, Mother, come back! There are men here again with axes. They are cutting our shade tree. Mother, come back! If the tree falls, I fall." And the woman dropped down among them again as though from the sky, and she held out her spear. She said, "As many as you are, I will stitch you with my big needle. Stitch, stitch." And this time they were all destroyed. So there was none to go back to the king. But when none returned, he knew. He knew. And he wanted this treasure. So the next morning, he called out to the women of the village, "All who are pregnant, give birth now." And a powerful man has powerful words. And all of the women with round bellies squatted on the ground, and they pushed their babies out. And they only had enough time to take long grass and tie it around the umbilical cord and snip it. Then the babies began to stand up or climb to their hands and their knees, still bright with their mother's blood, and trailing their umbilical cords. They began to totter and toddle into the bush. And there they found the tree, and they surrounded it. And Winsa heard the odd sound and looked down to see what looked like a tiny red horde at the foot of the tree. She realized that they were newborn babies. She thought they might be hungry, so she lowered the porridge pot down to them, and they swarmed it, but they did not eat the food. They plastered themselves with the porridge as though they were covering themselves in ornamental clay. And then the last born began to inch up the tree until it reached the place where Mwinsa sat. And the tiny child threw the baskets down to the others and then took his umbilical cord and tied it around her and began to drag her out of the tree and down to the ground. And when she was on the ground calling, "Mother, come back! Mother, come back!" all of the babies surrounded her, and each one took its umbilicus and tied it to some part of her. And some carried the baskets, but mostly they dragged the girl between them. "Mother, come back!" And her mother dropped down as though from the sky. she saw this unnatural sight of these babies bright with blood tied to her child by their umbilical cords. She said, "Many as you are, I shall stitch you. I shall stitch you with my sharp needle." But the babies paid her no heed. This strange procession continued through the bush and across the fields till it reached the edge of the village. And the mothers looking out saw their babies returning, and they sang "La, la, 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 la," a song in celebration. All but for the mother of Mwinsa, who walked stone-faced behind the procession. And once they had delivered the girl to the king, the babies fell into their mother's arms as though nothing unnatural had happened. And the king, looking upon her face, understood why her mother called her "she who nurses the sun." And when he looked at the baskets, he knew that they enriched his treasury 1,000-fold. And he was well pleased with this new wife. And her mother said, "Now that you have brought her here, you must care for her correctly. This girl makes baskets. Do not ask her to pound corn in a mortar. Do not ask her to go out at night and bring buckets of water back. If you do, I will know, and I will return." And then, knowing her daughter was lost to her, she left the village and went back to the bush bereft. So a wedding was held. And the next morning, the king was so pleased with his new bride that he wished to go out and hunt and have a feast. He said to his mother, "This girl is a special girl. What she does is she makes baskets, and look at them. They are as good as gold. Do not ask her to pound in a mortar. I will be back with food for all." And so the men left. And the mother was prepared to follow through with what her son had said, but his wives gathered around in a circle. And the queens, all looking at this new girl, said, "She has a pretty face. And yes, she makes these trinkets. But all of us must pound in a mortar. Surely she must too." And so they brought a mortar and set it before her. And Winsa shook her head no. They brought some kaffir corn, a meal. And she said no. So they took the meal away, and this time they brought hard kernels of corn, and she said no. And then they took her hands and they placed them on the pestle. And once the pestle was in her hands, she began to pound the corn in the mortar, and she sang a song. "Pound, I do not pound at home. Pound, I'm pounding to celebrate my wedding. Pound, yapoo, yapoo. If I pound, I go to God." And our little sister began to sink into the earth as she worked. "Pound, I do not pound at home. Pound, today I pound for my wedding. Pound, yahoo, yahoo. And if I pound, I go to God." And she sunk to her waist, to her shoulders, till even her head disappeared beneath the ground. But the mortar and the pestle kept working there on the spot where she had disappeared. And the queens said, "Well, clearly there is mystery here. We must be accountable and tell her mother what has happened, but who will do that? We'll call the crane. No. We'll call the crow. No. We'll call the quail. No. We'll call the doves." And they beckoned, and the doves came down. And they gave the message to the doves to take to the mother in the bush, and the birds flew as a flock. And they found the woman digging in the forest, and they settled in the trees around her, and they said, "Goo, goo, goo, goo. The one who nurses the sun is gone. Goo, 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 goo. She is gone. The one who nurses the sun. Goo, 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 goo. The one who nurses the sun is gone." And the mother, hearing this, prepared herself. She took a potsherd and she gathered medicines and put it on it. And then she picked up a scourge of animal tails, and she began to beat the earth as she walked. And as she walked through the forest and to the fields, anything she encountered, she said, "My daughter is dead, and you must die too." She said it to a zebra. She said it to people digging in a field. She said it to a man tanning a hide, and all of them died where they stood. And she entered the village, and she saw the mortar and pestle pounding away. And she dropped the scourge. And she took the medicine and scattered it over the loose ground and said, "Mwinsa, I am here to gather the herds of my mother. Mwinsa, get up. Mwinsa, I am here. I am gathering the herds of my mother and father. Mwinsa, get up." And hearing her mother calling, and covered in the ground with the medicine upon it, the girl began to rise up again, her head crowning from the dirt, and then her shoulders and her waist, until the earth had borne her anew. And she stood before her mother once more. I am finished.